projects. We also receive funds from California taxpayers who choose to donate to the Breast Cancer Fund on their state income tax returns. Many of you will be completing your returns in the next few months, so you may want to share your refunds with us. We will put them to good use. To date, the California Breast Cancer Research Program has funded 1,250 research projects around the state, totaling nearly $300 million. As I mentioned, this is our first attempt to host a virtual conference. I want to thank Dr. Katie McKenzie and the Council Outreach Committee for their work in creating this conference. We hope it proves an effective way to spread the word about the research our scientists are producing. There are no breast cancer research funders who are prioritizing prevention-related topics the way the California Breast Cancer Research Program is. We are working to make California the state with the lowest incidence of breast cancer. And we are doing that by emphasizing research that can change policy and practice in ways that reduce exposures for everyone. Today, you are going to hear about two important areas where we are exposed to agents that contribute to breast cancer: the workplace and the marketplace. And you will learn what we can do about it in our research, in our state, local, and workplace policies, by using our own purchasing power, and in our advocacy. While we each may be wondering, as we learn about exposures today, is my job giving me breast cancer? Should I use a different moisturizer? Our goal is not to make each person responsible for protecting themselves, but rather to create a state, a country, a world where our laws, our industries, our marketplaces work together to protect us all. The California Breast Cancer Research Program is guided by a council of committed scientists, activists, industry representatives, and nonprofit funders. Nonprofit leaders. I am pleased to introduce to you today the vice chair of that council and a member of the outreach committee that planned today's event, Erika Bell. Dr. Bell is the Director of Cancer Information and Education at Bay Area Cancer Connections. She will be moderating our plenary session on occupational risks and consumer products. Welcome, Erika.
Thank you, Mel, and good morning, everyone. It's my honor and pleasure to be here this morning to help moderate our first ever virtual conference. I'd also like to extend a thank you to my fellow outreach committee members and especially to Dr. Katie McKenzie for her assistance in pulling this conference together. So the questions and topics that we are going to address in this conference today are of utmost importance. And in my work as the Director of Cancer Information at Bay Area Cancer Connections, one of the most common questions I hear from both people who are potentially at risk for breast cancer and those that have been diagnosed is, what can I do to take power over my risk for breast cancer? And so I'm really excited that today's presentations will delve into the current research. And we'll start off by welcoming Peggy Reynolds and Bob Harrison, who will present on occupational chemical exposures in California and breast cancer risk. Dr. Peggy Reynolds is a professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of California, San Francisco, and a member of the UCSF Helen Diller Family Comprehensive Cancer Center. She received her PhD in epidemiology from the University of California, Berkeley, and spent several years in the California Department of Public Health, directing the Statistical Research Unit for the California Cancer Registry and the San Francisco Bay Area SEER program, and as the Chief of Environmental Epidemiology and Geographic Information Section. She has directed a number of epidemiology studies with a particular focus on environmental and occupational risk factors for breast cancer, and is currently a co-investigator for the UCSF NIEHS-funded Environmental Health Center, Environmental Research and Translation for Health, or EARTH Center. In collaboration with Dr. Robert Harrison, she co-directed the CBCRP-funded project on women's occupations and risk of cancer that they will be discussing today. And Dr. Bob Harrison is a public health medical officer with the California Department of Public Health Occupational Health Branch and clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco in the Division of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. He established the UCSF Occupational Health Services, where he has diagnosed and treated thousands of work and environmental injuries and illnesses. Dr. Harrison has led many work in environmental investigations of disease outbreaks. He has served as a technical and scientific consultant to federal OSHA and CDC NIOSH, and was a member of the California Occupational Safety and Health Standards Board. His research interests include the collection and analyses of California and national data on the incidence of work-related injuries and illnesses. Dr. Harrison has authored or co-authored more than 75 peer-reviewed journal articles and more than 40 book chapters, contributed articles, letters to the editor. He is the co-editor of the most recent edition of the textbook Occupational and Environmental Medicine. I extend a warm welcome to both of you, Peggy and Bob. I'm excited to hear your presentation. And if the audience members have questions, please enter them in the Q&A box. We will take all questions after the 3 plenary sessions have been presented.
Okay, thank you, Erika. Let me try to share screen here and get our presentation up. I'm quite delighted. Is this coming up? Ooh. There. Can you all see that? Hopefully. Yes. Okay, Bob says yes. Okay. So very happy to join this this discussion. I'm glad Bob and I can contribute based on some work we had the pleasure of doing under funding from CBCRP. Preaching to the choir, I'm sure to tell you that breast cancer is such an important disease in women. It's hormonally mediated. We have looked at a lot of traditional risk factors for breast cancer over the years, but it's kind of amazing that we know very little about occupational contributions to risk for this disease. So we were funded by CBCRP in response to an RFP entitled Occupational Chemical Exposures in California and Breast Cancer Risk. Our project had the overarching objective to advance our understanding of the degree to which workplace chemical exposures may increase breast cancer risk among California working women. This was a 5-year project in 3 phases, and today we're just going to talk about phases 1 and 2. Phase 1, year 1, was to begin to identify where women are employed in California, to identify workplace chemicals of concern for breast cancer risk, and to identify the overlap between the two. In year 2, we sought to identify key available data and any gaps in occupational chemical exposures for women working in California. And we created a database and data visualization tool of women's occupational exposures to known and suspected chemicals of concern in California. And we identified these as chemicals that are mammary gland carcinogens, mammary gland toxicants, and or endocrine disruptors. I want to do a shout out to our work advisory committee that helped guide the work that we did. Thanks to all of you, and it's nice, Jan, you're going to be on the presentation list. We look forward to hearing from you. So the methods that we used is, first of all, you would think we know where women work in California. You would think that there would be information available, and we reviewed a whole variety of data sources, and it turns out that really the best source of information we could find, albeit not perfect, was from the American Community Survey data from the US Census. Based on that, we summarized and compiled data on nearly 8 million women employed in California for all industries and occupations. It was roughly 500 occupations. These data also included sociodemographic characteristics of women in the workforce. We also compiled data from the US Census to incorporate in this, and included some estimates of informal workers derived by modeling data. So basically, for the period of observation for this study, roughly half of the women in California were actively engaged in the workforce. This is just a listing of the top 10 our occupations for women. Probably none of these come as a surprise to you in terms of where women work. What is notable is that the distribution of workforce members by race ethnicity was certainly not equal, and one of the most striking features, as I'm sure you can see on the far right, is the domination of Latinas engaged in the workforce for maids and housekeeping cleaners. We really wanted to get a handle on the informal workforce. These are jobs that don't show up in formal data sources and that really operate outside of established labor laws. There just are not reliable data on the numbers of informal workers by industry or occupation. So based on feedback from our advisory committee, we established a list of industries and occupations that are likely to have informal employment. And then we generated estimates of the number of women informally employed. I should say these need to be interpreted with caution. We used a couple of methods for estimating this. And again, you can see that by either estimate, there is a dominance in the informal workforce for maids and housekeeping cleaners. So one of the critical features is to look at chemicals of concern. And so we evaluated multiple data resources, and our final list was based primarily on the well-known work of our colleagues at Silent Spring Institute and their list of mammary gland carcinogens and toxicants, which we supplemented by TEDx list of endocrine disruptors. Based on this, we created a list of over 1,000 chemicals of concern for breast cancer, including these groups, and we categorized them into 27 groups based on chemical properties and or usage. And then we did construct another data set to summarize workplace sampling data from OSHA, although those data are extremely sparse by chemical and industry. So this is just a summary of the 27 categories that we created. And you can see from the Venn diagram, there's a certain amount of overlap in terms of categories. These chemicals are really dominated by their characteristics as endocrine disruptors, followed by mammary gland carcinogens and mammary gland toxicants. And so in order to estimate chemical exposures for workforce members, we used a job exposure matrix to identify that overlap of occupations and exposures. This included 145 occupations, which represented about 85% of the California workforce, female workforce. And we added 9 broad occupational groups that were identified by our advisory committee as likely to have a high proportion of informal workers. These were based on expert review by 2 industrial hygienists and tie-breaking review by Dr. Harrison. With this, we created a work database for those 1,000+ chemicals of concern, categorized as I just mentioned. And we created a job exposure matrix to identify the overlap for those occupations. And with all of this, we brought this together to create an interactive online visualization tool to provide information about the California female workforce by occupation, race, ethnicity, and age group. summarizing those chemicals of concern, identifying potential chemical exposures by occupation, and something which we hope will be useful and continue to be useful to multiple stakeholder groups. I am going to now turn it on over to Bob to talk a little bit about the data visualization tool, which, by the way, is available on CBCRP's website with the link that's indicated here. So, Bob.
Thanks, Peggy. So you can see that this is on the website. I'm just going to share a few screenshots. It was designed to be user-friendly in summary form, although we have a lot of data behind all of these visualization tools. We actually contracted with a pretty cool data visualization company that we worked with for about a year to figure out how to get this done. Peggy, could you just go back a couple of slides that seem to have gone forward? There you go. So you can see that we have a description of these major job categories and the working women that are at risk in 161 different occupations with visualization by size based on these little, I like to call them half moons. Next slide. You can go online and play with all of this. It's kind of cool. The working women at risk, we have it divided up by age here. You can see in the next slide. And we have, there you go. And then we have by specific occupations. So this is an example of maids and housekeeping cleaners, one of the largest groups that Peggy mentioned. And we categorize the probability of exposure into 3 categories: probable, possible, and unlikely. These were the 2 industrial hygienists. I got to be the tiebreaker where the 2 agreed, and I decided based on my medical and clinical experience. Next slide. And then you can also filter this by the category. One of the things that I was struck by during the course of this project is there are 1,000+ chemicals of concern. I mean, there's a lot of chemicals, and we couldn't possibly show each one of those individually, so we lumped them into categories. And here you can see the antimicrobials, and then you could filter it down to really understand, well, who's at risk of antimicrobial exposure? And here's a demonstration of maids and housekeepers. Next slide. In our phase 2, we identified gaps in our research. Peggy already mentioned that information about the informal workforce, which is probably growing each year in California. By informal, we mean independent contractors, cash only, under the table work. I mean, it's probably, by some estimates, probably 25% of the California economy works in that capacity. And they're probably more vulnerable for a number of reasons that we could get into in a discussion later. And we have relatively poor information about their exposures, and they're much harder to reach in terms of exposure assessment and intervention. Next slide. And it maybe comes to no surprise to anyone who's worked in occupational and environmental health that there's a lack of systematically collected quantitative chemical exposure data. Most of those 1,000 chemicals don't have good toxicology information to describe them. And moreover, there's relatively little information about quantitative levels of exposure. Next slide. When it comes to linking these exposures with information on cancer risk or cancer incidence through national and statewide population surveys, there's also this research gap that exists. And in terms of biomonitoring, how to assess exposures through blood or urine or other biomonitoring techniques, there's very limited data that's nationally representative on this workforce. Next slide. So we made a number of recommendations in terms of next research strategies, to do some exploratory analysis linking to cancer outcome data, to improve our work, job exposure matrix, and to prioritize occupations and industries for greater tracking and biomonitoring. Next slide. So we're very happy that our work is being extended by colleagues at the Silent Spring Institute, UC Berkeley and UC San Francisco and DePaul. And so they kindly provided a few slides to just show how I think our work and research can be extended in an important way. And this is to identify immigrant women. Next slide. And I think some of our colleagues are joining this call. So maybe during the discussion, they can chime in here, because I really want to give them full credit. And this is to identify female immigrant workers using the American Community Survey data that Peggy mentioned, but identifying those women who were born outside the United States of working age between the age of 18 and 65, with over 116,000 workers identified in the United States, and then using our job exposure matrix as a tool to identify their specific risk of chemicals of concern for breast cancer. So here's an example of just a small amount of their data that we were particularly interested in and had a really fruitful conversation about. And this is stratified by major occupations in which women are employed, and you can see the country of birth. And on the far left, you can see that same house cleaner group that we mentioned earlier, and how they're, not surprising, really predominantly from Latin America, but it varies across these occupational groups, which I think gives us really important information about further research and investigation. Next slide. And then the other way that our colleagues have been beginning to analyze this data is to look by occupation and then cross-tabbing in a really very useful visual way their exposure to 6 of the groups that we had developed to breast cancer relevant chemicals. And so if you just take, by example, let's just take the house cleaners, which appears on the far left, and you move your eye upward, you can see that purple corresponds to the probable categories. Really what we then need to do is begin to develop exposure assessment tools and to characterize this risk and to link to cancer registry data. And I think this will give us a really important tool to prioritize prevention and intervention. Next slide. So I want to thank everybody. You could read more about it here. We published this in New Solutions in 2022. Stella Beckman, who is a collaborator with us. Next slide. And thanks to a very long list of collaborators, and of course to CBCRP, to getting us going and really instigating this research. Thanks. Oh, Peggy has one more slide. She can't resist. Peggy, what do you want to say about this slide?
No, I just wanted to share. So
Okay.
thank you. I hope we stayed within our time frame. I'm going to stop sharing now and turn it back to Erika.
Excellent. Thank you, Peggy and Bob, for that really informative talk. It's wonderful to have that database as a resource. I know I was on there exploring the other day, and there's a lot to see and learn. And I'm sure we'll have some great questions from the audience about it. As a reminder, enter them into the Q&A box and we'll address them at the end. But now we will move on to a presentation by Bhavna Shamasunder, I hope I'm saying that correctly, and Janette Robinson-Flint, who will present on taking stock product use among Black and Latina women. So I'd like to welcome Bhavna and Janette. Bhavna Shamasunder is an associate professor and chair at the Urban and Environmental Policy Department and co-chair of the Public Health Program at Occidental College in Los Angeles. She teaches and conducts on environmental justice with a focus on the disparate and cumulative burdens faced by low-income communities of color who live in urban environments. Her research is community engaged in partnership with those most impacted. Her active research projects include health impacts from neighborhood oil drilling in Los Angeles, the environmental injustice of beauty that considers health disparities for women of color from synthetic chemicals in consumer products. She is co-PI of the Taking Stock study with Black Women for Wellness that examines health, economic, and social burdens surrounding consumer product use among women of color. Her work has been supported by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, the CBCRP, and the National Science Foundation. She received her doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management, a master's in environmental studies from the Yale School of the Environment, and a bachelor's degree in biology and developmental studies from UC San Diego. And Janette Robertson Flint I extend a warm welcome to you as well. As a founding member of Black Women for Wellness, she holds the executive director position. Her work in the health field began as an advocate during her pregnancy, seeking a holistic practitioner to work with, given her concept of gentle birth. Today, she is part of the Reproductive Justice Coalition of Los Angeles, California Coalition for Reproductive Freedom, and National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. Over the course of the years, her journey has included the Birthing Project USA Los Angeles, Great Beginnings for Black Babies, National Health Foundation, March of Dimes, California Primary Care Association, Inglewood Healthy Mothers and Babies, South Los Angeles Health Project, and Women, Infant, and Children programs. An alumni of the University of Southern California, she is currently seeking a doctorate in community organization development. And her other love is radio. She has produced day-long specials celebrating the lives of African-American leaders, weekly programs highlighting women's voices with Talking Book, African World News, Family Tree, Some of Us Are Brave, and Liberated Sisters radio programs. She enjoys great food, a good storybook or movie, spoken word, live music, salsa dancing, and scenic walks in Los Angeles. To Janette, a victory that encourages health for women and girls grounds her through the challenges, traffic, and the struggle for freedom. So thank you both for being here and sharing your research with us this morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, 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 great. So I am practicing my technology. I know you see one slide that talks about the name of our study, the Taking Stock study, personal care product exposures for Black and Latino women. I think first I want to start out with my thank yous, because it's always important to acknowledge the folks who have held you up and made it happen. And so thank you so much, Bhavna, and thank you, California Breast Cancer Research Council. This is very much a study that is directed by community and engaging the community, and has arisen from community questions, right? So the community question we had at Black Women for Wellness is, why is it that Black women are being diagnosed with late stages of breast cancer, and why is there an epidemic of breast cancer in our community? The office that I work in, Black Women for Wellness, actually at one point had 4 women who had diagnoses of breast cancer. And we thought that was a lot for an office of approximately 25 folks, and that includes men also. So the values that we brought to the table were community input, accountability for the research. We did not want to have a research program where researchers came in the community, gathered data, and then went back to the academy, and we never heard from them again. We never experienced or never got to see what the the data it was that they found, or what the implications were, or even had a chance to figure out what policy recommendations we would need based on the data. And we also value the community input, not only for the accountability, but for the framing and the how we put the context around the reports that we would share with the data. So when we started this program, it was, or this is the geographic area that we were looking at, which is South Los Angeles.
Jan, I'm wondering, sorry to interrupt you. Are you able to make yours full screen? Go to view full screen or slideshow full
Hold
screen.
on, I'm gonna try it.
I'm sorry. Yes, because I think all the notes and it's tiny. So if you go to slideshow at the top.
Well, my
Oh.
problem with going to slideshow at the top right now is that all of the Zoom information is there. So let me try it in another way.
If not, I could share mine and you could.
Okay, you can share
You want me
yours.
to
and
do
then I
that?
can notes.
Okay. Can you can you see my screen?
I think I still see my screen.
No.
Okay,
Okay, great.
there we go. So
Perfect,
we can
thank
go
you.
to the third slide. And that is a geographic area of Los Angeles. And so the geographic area of I should say this, that our study was scheduled to start in 2020. And as you all might recall, we had a pandemic in 2020, or in March of 2020. So I will talk a little bit about how that did not change the geographic areas that we were targeting, but it did change some of the ways we went about trying to get the information, knowing that we had to work with our new realities. So I'm going to go to the next slide. What we knew: women of color are disproportionately exposed to consumer product chemicals. So we knew that the beauty industry has a $9 billion annual sales. We knew that the women of color were using a great deal of chemicals with our personal care, with our cleaning products, with our beauty products. Personal care being defined as tampons, pads, etc. And then the beauty products are the makeup, shampoos, that type of thing. And then the fourth category would be cleaning products. So we knew that many of these chemicals were having an impact on our health and well-being. But as mentioned with the last research team, we did not have enough data that would share the why or the connection of that. So we started with those assumptions that we needed some data, and that we also knew that women of color used a great deal of products. From there, and when I go to the next, we put together this wonderful, fabulous team of folks. And that is one of the pictures of us, and that represents Black Women for Wellness, Occidental College, Silent Spring, Columbia, and the LA Grit. Is Sandy in that picture? No. But so we also put together a community advisory board with California Latinas for Reproductive Justice, Black Women's Network, which was or is a coalition of Black women business owners Many of those business owners are in the beauty industry, having beauty salons, and then communities for a better environment. So that was the community team and the research team that was put together, because between us, all of us had deep roots and deep connection into the community of women that we wanted to engage with this research study. And we knew that those women had the same concerns that we had the same exposures that we had, and would have a voice and engagement in trying to get the data. So next slide. What we put together in terms of the tools, we created a video, which I will show you a part of. We had surveys, we did listening groups. We, with Silent Spring, developed an app, Taking Stock app for scanning products, and also how much the survey took into account how often and how much we use the data. So can we show a tiny bit of the app, the video?
I'm the Executive Director of Black Women for Wellness. Thank you for taking part in our Taking Stock study. The Taking Stock study is a community-driven research project. We have partners. It's Black Women for Wellness, it's Occidental College, Silent Spring Institute, LA Grid, and the most important part of this project is you, as our community. So we're looking at how Black and brown women use chemicals. What are those products that we use are toxic chemicals, and how those products impact our health. The average person uses 26 products every day. This is just my walking around stuff. I didn't bring the bathroom with me, but we use a lot of products. So what we're asking you to do is scan in your products, your lip gloss, your lipstick, your hair care. Thank you so much for participating in our study, because it couldn't be done without you. And it's important because we need to know about our health and well-being.
If you've been in a car
Oh,
accident,
Steve, now don't let us hear. I'm going to show
use
you
this AI app instead.
this. Yep.
Okay. So, and as you saw with the video, it really very much emphasized that you, in terms of our community, is the important part of this study. So that was our primary value, that it was driven by community, we would be accountable to community, and we will share the information and tools with community that came from this research study, as well as use it as a tool to develop whatever policy we wanted to move forward. Bhavna?
Am I unmuted? Okay. So I will maybe talk through, this was a 3-year study. We're still analyzing a lot of our data. But I want to share with you sort of the structure of the study and some of the big kind of main level findings that we had. And then one of the things that we can share online is the papers that have come from this, and then some of the pipeline as we go. So our study was a 3-part study. The first was a statewide survey where we actually looked at, was an online survey. It closed as soon as the pandemic hit in the March of 2020. And we ended the online survey. It was California-wide, and we're really looking at product use across all races and ethnicities. So whoever could take the survey between the ages of 18 and 49, they were invited to do so. That gave us kind of a baseline of just what a lot of different groups are using. But what I want to share today is our community-based data collection that was focused in South Los Angeles. And we recruited 70 women who live in South Los Angeles. And we were interested in what products they used, how often they used them, and every time they used a product over 7 days, they would scan it with an app that was created by our team and led by the Silent Spring Institute. And so we got frequency and breadth of use. And that was, and at the very end of the study, we had a biomonitoring sample, which I won't share today. There was subsequent funding that we got from the Rose Foundation to help us do some biomonitoring, since we were gathering so much data. We wanted to be able to gather that as well. But our product use data was, it was hard to do. I'll just say that community-based research is time consuming. It's very hard, and 70 might feel like a small number, but during a pandemic and trying to get people to, you know, learn an app, learn it online. We had to do a reminder phone call midweek. People were confused. They could call us. It is, you know, a lot of work. So this is a visual of the app. It creates a personalized inventory of products. So we're really interested in how to, what the actual products women were using every day looked like. And it also has this, so you could scan your product, and then the database that Silent Spring Institute has, if it caught it, it would show up, but if not, you would have to manually enter your product and then create, take a picture. This was quite a good learning experience, because most of what people scanned were not in the database, and we actually created quite a massive inventory of products that are being used by women in South Los Angeles. So this is a tool that we're going to be using for our next study as well. And so it's being refined right now. But one of the things that people use a ton of products. We created a really, so I should have had a demographic slide, but it seems to, I don't, but the 70 women were between the ages of 18 and 49. Black Women for Wellness recruited the Black women, and our Promotora group led by Sandy Navarro recruited Latinas. And so the recruitment was, you know, done in a community engaged way. And so I think that really informed the participants that did engage. But we ended up with folks using, you know, 1,200 to 1,500 products that were used by women in our study. So this was a huge number of products. So there were lots of hand and body lotions and creams. There was hair oil, and you can kind of see the distribution of these personal care products. This is not also including the home products. But I wanted to focus here on the personal care products. One of the things we wanted to talk about here is sort of the tools we developed and how we might use them in the future, and the strategies for, you know, having people do this in the future. So we had kind of a distribution that tells us sort of what people use every day and then the number. But one of the things that's really important is that for example, lotion is something that women talked a lot about in our focus groups, wanting to be able to make sure that they don't look ashy or don't appear professional in the workplace, are hydrated in a dry LA environment. But the many lotions we've documented, they're not the same kinds of products, right? Ingredient lists can be long or they can be simple. The other thing is that not only is that not all lotions are the same, but we found that very few people actually use the same product. So if we documented, you know, 70 lotions or 90 lotions, they weren't actually much overlap, which shows that the segregation and the kind of proliferation of products that the beauty industry is doing. You know, you could be using a product with one name one day, jasmine scented lotion, and then the next day it's off the shelf and you have a lily scented lotion. And so it's a really big moving target, and something that we find is a very challenging outcome of our, like the sheer number of products, and then the sheer churn in the industry of replacing those products over time, over and over again. So replacing products becomes very, very challenging. What do you tell people to buy? And so these, we saw many ingredients of health concern in our products that we identified. And one of the things that we had to think about is how do we share these data? I won't go through all of these. I think this audience is well versed in all of these that we found in our products, but of the 1,400, we wanted to test several of these products. Out of the 14, we could afford to test about 20. And so we did send some to a lab for testing, but we've used what's on the label of the products. And so many of these chemicals that are found in these products are linked with health concerns that Jan mentioned to begin with. And so there are things that we are thinking about. How do you navigate with participants when the ingredient labels are so complicated? Every participant used a product with a fragrance. And this was something that even in our surveys and our focus groups, when we asked people, do you try to avoid a fragrance? Do you use unscented products? We found that this is actually quite hard to avoid. People are wanting to use unfragranced products, but just because a label says unscented doesn't mean there's no scent. And just because it doesn't have a label that it's scented doesn't mean it's unscented. So it's a really big challenge. There were also many products with parabens and formaldehyde releasers, which I'll come back to formaldehyde releasers in a second. Parabens are probably the most common things of concern, chemicals of concern in the products that we looked at versus in everything. They're in everything. So 27 of the 95 lotions contain parabens. We do think that these are coming out more and more often. What we because of a market pressure, what we don't have good information on is what is actually going in to replace them. So that's another question. We did find that people are trying to use clean products and use that label that says clean beauty, but that's also an unregulated area. Information is what is informed the study we're working on now. That's also funded by CBCRP in thinking about chemical hair straighteners. And so 4 of the 19 hair gels contained formaldehyde releasers. So also an area of health concern for our participants. And there's just a lot of them. There's just a lot of different ones. And so again, a big moving target of what we can, and people always ask, what can I use instead? And what can I use instead of this? What can I always replace it with? So we do work, many of us work with BCPP and their Black owned beauty brands. And so we give folks as much information as we can. So here's an example of one thing that we've distributed to our participants after the study. We recently published a paper showing some of the impacts of education. So one of the things that we did find is that education among Black women for wellness participants was much higher than the Latinas we recruited. Since they were differently recruited, we think Black Women for Wellness has a base of people who are more educated and already thinking about some of this, but less education within all the groups and not race and ethnicity was significantly associated with a greater likelihood of using scent altering products. And so this is an examination of the menstrual and intimate care products that women were using. We just published this, just came out in Frontiers in Reproductive Health, and we can make it available for the link on the conference website, but this is an infographic that went in the paper that I think demonstrates some of the distribution. So scented tampons, scented pads, these are areas of really sensitive tissue. The fact that these are on the market is of concern, but women do use them, and the more educated they are, the less often. So I think education is an area that we will be thinking about as we go along. Jen, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. I saw Nancy from Breast Cancer Prevention Partners put a link in the chat for the Black Beauty Project, and kudos to the work that they have been doing with the Beauty Justice Coalition. and the fact that the many products that Bhavna mentioned, the 1,200 that these 70 women use, were not in the general databases that we have found, like Environmental Working Group or Skin Deep, etc. So we were happy to partner with Silent Springs, to begin to put this in a database, because what we found is that women were very much interested in learning about their toxic exposure through the products that we use. So with the focus groups, there were plenty of conversation about what can we do to substitute, or what product could we use that's clean. So these are some of the comments from the focus group. When I was trying to use those chemicals in my private area, my body would let me know so quickly that I couldn't use this. One of the things I think that Bhavna mentioned that I want to highlight is that older Black women were more likely to use scented products for personal hygiene. And we attributed this to the very stringent beauty standards that Black women are held to. So they had 13 or 14 ingredients in the list. If there are 10 or less products and I can't pronounce or enunciate them, then I don't use them. So that is what people were saying is, like, if we can't pronounce these products, or if we can't really read them because there are so many syllables in the ingredient, then they didn't want to use it. And not even talking about the cumulative impact of using more than one product that had many chemicals, or using products daily for years at a time. Then the first relaxer was at 6 years old. That was not uncommon. And I know in the interest of time, I will let us keep it moving forward. These are two of the infographics that we have been able to put out in the community. Sandy with LA Grit, part of our team, is the graphic designer for these products, but for the infographics, and has been doing an excellent job of putting things very readable and very accessible for the community members who are participating with the study. I'll let you do that, Bhavna.
One of the things that we're still working on and we're trying to refine is, how do you report product use back to communities? This is a work in progress. It's hard to do. People don't always log into the Derby website that Silent Spring has developed. So we have mailed results to everyone and follow up by phone. It's something we're still really thinking about. We're going to have a community meeting for questions, but we answer questions on the phone, but it's definitely a work in progress. And then our findings from our current study have been really informative for our, for the last study, have been informative for what we're doing now, which is we're conducting a study on with 35 to 50 women who are actively trying to transition away from using chemical hair straighteners. So we're just starting that now. We're collecting data now, and we'll share more about that next time. So thank you so much to our full team. There's a lot of us. And all of our community partners and participants and CBCRP for funding this work, since there's not very many funders that do. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhavna and Janette, for that wonderful talk. Your research project is a really beautiful example of the community-based research projects that CBCRP is so keen on supporting. So thank you for that. Next, we're going to move to our last plenary talk given by Dr. Meg Schwarzman, titled "The Impact of Public Policies on Chemical Exposures Relevant to Breast Cancer." And Dr. Meg Schwarzman MD, MPH, is a physician and environmental health scientist in UC Berkeley School of Public Health. She also serves as an associate director of health and environment for the interdisciplinary Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry. Her research and teaching focuses on environmental contributions to breast cancer, chemicals policy, and strategies for applying environmental health knowledge to design and selection of safer materials. Welcome, Meg.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Let's see if I can get this to go into presentation mode and share the right screen with you. Okay, do you see the large screen as opposed to a note screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, excuse me, I'm sorry. We started this project 5 years ago with an amazing team from both UC Berkeley and Silent Spring Institute, the shadow partners in all the presentations today. We officially wrapped up actually more than a year ago, but we're still moving the final papers through the publication process. And I'm going to provide a very brief overview of just some of our findings because we have many aspects to this project. So our overarching question was whether Prop 65 has affected Californians' exposure to carcinogens and to reproductive or developmental toxicants. And we had a particular focus on breast carcinogens. So if you're in California, you know that Prop 65 is the law behind this kind of public-facing warning. But also at the heart of the law is a list of toxic chemicals identified by the state. And whereas these public-facing warnings are the most visible element of the law, we really suspected that the presence of chemicals on the list might actually have the biggest impact because of how businesses use that list to reformulate away from chemicals and avoid having to warn consumers. So we turned over many stones in this investigation, but the ones I'd like to talk about here are first the process that we went through for identifying breast carcinogens. Sorry, my advance isn't working. What we refer to as breast cancer relevant chemicals, or BCRCs, and we used mechanistic information to build out a more comprehensive list than the one that previously existed. Next, I will present our investigation into where Prop 65 chemicals appeared in products, analyzing the inventory of volatile chemicals in consumer and commercial products that's reported to the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. Next, I will show how we used NHANES biomonitoring data as a direct measure of changing population level exposures and our attempt to link those changing exposures to policy actions, specifically Prop 65. And finally, based on some higher profile enforcement actions, we conducted a couple of case studies that we're revealing, and today I'll talk about the diesel exhaust case study. Okay, so the foundational process of identifying breast cancer relevant compounds, or BCRCs, it was just published last week in Environmental Health Perspectives, and the paper outlines our methods. It also includes the actual list of BCRCs in the supplemental information, and that's all freely available online. And the link to the paper, and therefore the supplemental information with the list, is on the conference website. In total, we identified 921 breast cancer relevant exposures. That's 920 chemicals plus ionizing radiation. And we started by updating the list of over 200 chemicals that cause mammary tumors in animals. That was originally published by Ruth Ann Rudell and her collaborators at Silent Spring in 2007. And since most chemicals haven't been tested in cancer bioassays in animals, what we've added here is the mechanistic information. So identifying not only chemicals that cause cancer by damaging DNA, but also chemicals that act on cells and either increase the production of estradiol or progesterone, or that trigger the estrogen receptor. And that's because these hormones, as we've talked about already today, are known to increase breast cancer risk. So you'll notice that this adds up to more than 920, and that's because some of the chemicals have multiple effects. And we actually looked at that overlap of chemical attributes and found that chemicals that produce mammary tumors in animals were also more likely to affect hormone levels compared with chemicals that don't cause mammary tumors. And those results are shown in this graphic that's in the paper, looking at mammary carcinogens here compared to non-mammary carcinogens, and the proportion of them that have an endocrine disrupting effect specific to estrogen and progesterone. So this suggests that chemicals that alter hormones, like we know, can be carcinogenic. And the implication really is that we can start taking regulatory action on these chemicals accordingly, specifically based on the mechanistic data and the way that corresponds to what we see in lab results. While we were developing that list of breast cancer relevant chemicals, we wanted to understand sources of exposure to chemicals that were listed by Prop 65. So to do that, we repurposed data that's collected by the California Air Resources Board in its survey of consumer and commercial products. They collect information on VOC content, volatile organic chemical content, because VOCs contribute to ground level ozone formation. But we actually use the ingredient information, crossing it with the list of Prop 65 chemicals, so that we could identify products that could expose people to Prop 65 carcinogens, reproductive and developmental toxicants. And we published that analysis in Environmental Science and Technology, and the link is also on the conference website. So we found 33 different Prop 65 VOCs reported in 105 different product categories. The category rather than the specific product is all that's available in this data. So these include some really well-known toxicants like diethanolamine, methylene chloride, trichloroethylene, and many others. And some of those were reported in up to 60 product categories, anywhere from a couple to up to 60 different categories. The data, as I said, are only available publicly at the level of general product categories, but we could look at emissions, how much the CARB estimates is emitted of the volatile Prop 65 chemical in each product category. So the chemicals are along the x-axis and the product categories are along the y-axis to understand the potential exposure sources. In total, we estimated that 5,000 tons of Prop 65 VOCs were emitted from products in California in 2014, which was the year of the best survey data. And in this heat map, the color in the squares corresponds to the emissions in tons per day. So the highest emitting chemicals and product categories are here in the lower left-hand corner. And some of those highest emission chemicals include BCRCs like styrene and tetrachloroethylene. And the product categories that those chemicals appear in, you can kind of correspond them through the blocks to the product categories on the left, are, as you'll see, most likely heavily used in workplaces. Things such as vehicle repair products, care products, sealants, caulking compounds, adhesives, and general purpose cleaners, to get back to some of the work we've already seen today about the presence of vulnerable populations in jobs, particularly cleaning jobs. This has real implications. So we zeroed in on 30 product categories that contained multiple different Prop 65 VOCs. So one category containing, more than a dozen different Prop 65 VOCs. And we identified these categories that we thought were used predominantly in workplaces, ones that were used routinely in the home, and ones that were used directly on the body. Honestly, it sort of shocked us that there are this many Prop 65 chemicals distributed so widely throughout the material economy. And it really underscored for us how widespread is our exposure to toxics. From these data, we noted the potential for co-exposure to multiple toxics from a single product category, like the examples I just showed, where, say, other adhesives category contains 17 different Prop 65 listed VOCs, as well as the potential for aggregate exposures, that is, exposure to a single chemical from multiple different product categories. And for example, diethanolamine, which is a formaldehyde releasing compound, was present in 40 different product categories. And I think this really echoes and supports what we've seen in the work previously presented today. And just as a reminder, this database, the CARB database, only includes volatile compounds. So we're only looking at a subset of Prop 65 chemicals that are volatile. And it really underestimates our total exposure to Prop 65 chemicals from products that are used both by individual consumers and in workplaces. This study and the links to some of the articles about it are on the conference website. But since that BCRC list was just published last week, we have gone on and combined these two analyses so that we could identify the breast cancer relevant chemicals that I presented first with the CARB data on volatile chemicals in California products. And together we found that there were 23 volatile BCRCs in a total of 145 different product categories. This is a look at some of that. So these, I'm only showing here product categories with 3 or more of the volatile BCRCs. This is the number of breast cancer related chemicals. And then these are the categories that they show up in. And some categories like personal care products report, 10 different BCRCs in them. And these are, again, just the volatile ones. And also high on the list are some of the occupational categories we saw earlier here, adhesives and vehicle repair, and then also nail coatings, which corresponds with these work categories of salon workers that we know are likely fairly highly exposed. Slicing the data from the other direction, this shows the identity of each of the volatile BCRCs that appear in the CARB database, and then how many product categories each of those is reported in. So in this graph, I've omitted ethanol because that's reported in nearly 130 categories. We really don't know. So the cancer risk associated with inhaling ethanol from consumer or commercial products, it's probably much lower than the risk from drinking alcoholic beverages, but it hasn't really been thoroughly studied. The reason we eliminated here really is just to make it easier to read these data on a slide. In summary from this, while the CARB database limits us to these volatile chemicals, it's still helpful for understanding possible sources of exposure and by correspondingly setting priorities for regulation and also for product reformulation to see where some of these chemicals show up. The third analysis that I want to discuss from our project took us deep into the NHANES biomonitoring data to ask whether Prop 65 has affected exposure to Prop 65 to listed chemicals at the population level. So this publication is currently in revision. It should be out in the next month or so. We'll be happy to see it. And we used 17 years of NHANES data, both at publicly available national data and also restricted data that's specific to California, and that we obtained through a research agreement with the CDC's Research Data Center. We compared biomonitoring levels in California versus the rest of the US population for a total of 37 chemicals in these groups: phthalates, phenols, VOCs, metals, PAHs, and PFASs, and to see if we could detect an influence of Prop 65 listing, we compared changes in exposure to Prop 65 listed chemicals and non-listed chemicals. So for 15 chemicals that were not listed during the biomonitoring period and another 11 chemicals that were listed before biomonitoring started, we looked at changes over time and compared California to the rest of the US. And then there were 11 chemicals that were actually listed during the biomonitoring period, and we could try to look at whether there were changes in exposure relating to the timing of Prop 65 listing by comparing California to the rest of the US. Overall, we found that Californians have lower body burdens of many chemicals, and also that most decreased over time. Of the 37 chemicals that we analyzed, 18 of them were significantly lower in California compared to the rest of the US. Only 4 were significantly higher in Californians, and 25 significantly decreased over time, or looking at the before and after Prop 65 listing window. And this is an example of what those analyses look like for each chemical compound that we looked at. It's really hard to attribute changing exposures to a single policy lever like Prop 65, but we did find some interesting associations, including that Prop 65 listing may prompt manufacturers to reformulate products in a kind of quiet compliance with the law. So this figure shows biomonitoring levels for the metabolite of benzyl butyl phthalate, and exposures were relatively stable in the years preceding Prop 65 listing, which is this red line, and after which time those levels appear to decline. And a similar pattern exists for dibutyl phthalate, or the metabolite of dibutyl phthalate. Both dropped significantly over this time period. And so in a separate part of the project that I haven't described today, our interviews with businesses suggest that this kind of change really may be reflecting a pre-regulatory effect. So Prop 65 listing might trigger an action by manufacturers to reformulate. And the size of the California market makes it really impractical for businesses to formulate different products for different regions. So their changes would probably affect the whole country over time. Which might be part of why we didn't see the declines manifest differently in California versus the rest of the country. So the thing is, this might look like a win, but looking at what happened with another phthalate during the same time period points out that Prop 65 can identify hazardous chemicals, but it can't guide their substitution. Diisononyl phthalate was a phthalate that probably substituted for other phthalates that were already listed. And you can see that when other phthalates were listed, levels of the metabolites of diisononyl phthalate increased in the US population until it was itself listed on Prop 65, after which time the levels decline. In our final example from the project, I want to talk about the case study on diesel exhaust, which led to an in-depth investigation of California's many policies, a whole suite of policies that reduce diesel emissions, and we published that in the journal Science. In this case, we were able to really clearly link policy actions to changes in emissions and ultimately to exposures to this source of hazardous air pollution that's also associated with breast cancer risk. So we came across, this is where it started, this graph from not our publication that shows a dramatic decline in California's emissions of diesel particulate matter starting around 1990 when it was listed as a carcinogen on Prop 65. And that happened at the same time as diesel vehicle miles traveled and general economic activity were both going up. So we said to ourselves, wow, California really reduced emissions of diesel exhaust after it was listed. Did Prop 65 have anything to do with that? And to skip to the bottom line, through lots of interviews and document review, we concluded that Prop 65 probably lowered local diesel exhaust emissions because of some specific legal actions that targeted grocery store distribution centers and idling school buses and actions at ports. But that it also may have helped the TAC designation, diesel particulate matter designation as a toxic air contaminant. But it was primarily these actions by the California Air Resources Board that were behind the emissions reductions. So we followed that thread instead. And we looked closely at this graph, overlaying it with the timeline of the actions that CARB took on state policies for diesel exhaust. And what we came up with was the conclusion that California decreased their diesel emissions significantly more than the rest of the country. We compared mobile source diesel emissions data for California versus the rest of the US for this time period. And to orient to this figure for the moment, the colored bands are emissions of diesel particulate matter in metric tons between 1990 and 2014. And their color designates which sector the emissions come from. And the black line shows how diesel fuel use was changing in the same time period. And we show data from the country as a whole minus California, and separately the data for California. All of this is percent changes from relative to the 1990 values. So the bottom line is that California reduced diesel emissions by 78%, while diesel emissions in the rest of the country dropped by 51% during the same time period. And all of this happened while diesel use was continuing to go up in both regions. And so how did this happen? We're going to look at the single category of HDDV, which is the biggest category. and see specifically what happened in this sector. So overall, California reduced emissions in that sector by 85% compared to the rest of the US that just dropped it 60%. And the way that this happened is because of some things that happened in the country as a whole, which adopted low sulfur fuels and tighter emissions limits for new engines. Although in California, those rules came earlier and they were stricter than at the federal level. But the key thing that really set California on a different trajectory was the state's requirement to retrofit or replace older engines. A diesel engine lasts like 20 years or 1 million miles. And California essentially decided that waiting for fleet turnover was too slow and that CARB rules would hold all diesel engines to a higher standard. And we found that in a separate analysis that if the US had followed the same, or if California had followed the same trajectory as the rest of the country, our emissions would only have dropped 58% compared to 85% that we did. So we saw this bear out when we looked at the emissions per vehicle mile traveled, and California trucks emitted less than half of the diesel particulate matter per vehicle miles traveled as trucks in the rest of the US. This is looking at all of the states along the x-axis. So we're less than half of the median of 336. So what I've walked you through here is only the findings for trucks and buses. We actually looked at it in all other sectors also, and we were similarly able to link specific CARB policies to emission reductions in California that outpaced the rest of the country. And we also did a mortality analysis that showed that the gains were bore out in lower diesel-related deaths as well. So this was a pretty dramatic example of a public health gains associated with a suite of public policies. I want to circle back for just a moment to our sort of summarize some of these key findings from each aspect. One is we saw identified more than 900 memory carcinogens, including steroidogens or estrogen receptor agonists. We found exposures to Prop 65 listed volatile compounds, organic compounds that are common in consumer and commercial goods in California. We highlighted some consumer and workplace products, that could expose people to breast carcinogens. And we also identified some priority chemicals, both for workers and for fence lining communities. We also showed that Californians have lower concentrations of most biomonitored Prop 65 chemicals, which may support some of our leadership on environmental regulation. And despite the fact that there were many causal factors and we can't totally detangle them, Prop 65 does appear to drive changes that may reduce exposures. We also looked at this example that I finished with about CARB regulations reducing diesel exhaust exposure and mortality in California compared to the rest of the country. And going back to our NHANES data, we actually saw evidence of that reduced diesel exhaust exposure in NHANES data. I just want to return again to thank CBCRP for supporting Dreaming Up, really, and supporting the project, and of course, all of the collaborators who I'm just the spokesperson for today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Schwarzman, for showcasing several aspects of your work. It was really interesting, and it's nice to see that some positive progress is being made. Thank you for that. We're going to open up the session to questions now, so please do take the time to enter your questions into the Q&A. We got a couple in the chat already, so I'll start with one for Janette and Bhavna, which is, did you see that you came up with a challenge due to using the Taking Stock app for those women who were perhaps technically challenged and didn't know how to use an app on their smartphone or who had a language barrier?
So we did our research, and I didn't neglect to say this, in both Spanish and in English. And so the app was available in both languages. We translated everything into 2 languages. And so we had many monolingual Spanish speakers in our study. And it was a challenge. is the best thing to say that. And I think we, had to show people on video or on the phone. I mean, I think if we had been able to, as we designed the study, walk into people's homes and show them and help them learn, that would have been a different scenario. But given it was a pandemic, we ended up doing a lot of troubleshooting, kind of on video or phone, and some people still struggled with it. So we have to call them back, or we could see their back end and we could see that they weren't actually logging anything. So I think it is hard. Although the alternative, we're not sure exactly how else you would get this fine level data, except to try to figure out an easy scanning method like this. So, but people do catch on. Some of them need some more support.
Yeah, I did answer Bob's question in the chat. Sandy is absolutely bilingual and was very accessible in terms of how people saw her as friendly and engaging. So that was helpful. And the other thing I said, we ran many a beta tests before we let this this app out into the world. So we tested it, and we tested it with folks who are technically challenged like myself. So they got all those questions, and folks who had, I'm going to say, antique technology. Like, people ask me, do I have a smartphone or an iPhone all the time? I don't. Bhavna just gave me that lecture this morning about having an iPhone. But so we did keep those things in mind.
Thank you. And we have a question for Meg, which is, does the CARB database have a threshold for reporting?
Thanks. So the reporting to CARB is mandatory, which takes care of some of the issues that happen with other online product ingredient databases, which we were not able to use. And CARB does a lot of sort of quality control and checking on the information that's reported to them. Some of it is not publicly reported. So, for example, we don't know the concentration of each ingredient in each product category, but they are listed in the database in their order of concentration. And then the other piece of data that we worked with is the emissions data, where CARB is actually measuring how much is emitted, and then has a whole way of estimating where those emissions go, sort of fate and transport data. As far as the one of my collaborators is actually tracking down whether there's in the ingredient reporting what the threshold might be in ingredient reporting. So I can get back to you about that in the chat.
Thank you. I also had another question for you, Meg, or anyone else who might want to chime in who's looking at different chemicals. You noted the focus on estrogenic chemicals. I wondered if there's been any research looking at things that might contribute more specifically to triple negative or HER2 positive breast cancers.
Sorry, I don't know if that's directed at me. I was deferring to others who have done more of that work.
Okay. Let's see. So Peggy and Bob, I wondered, now that we're aware that house cleaners are exposed to a plethora of different chemicals, what would the next step be that could result in some concrete changes? If you're cleaning your house yourself, is there any way to have a list of products that are safer to bring to the store? Or if you hire cleaners, is there a way to get those companies to use the safer products with their employees?
I saw Bob nodding. I thought,
Okay, well, no, it's a great question, Erika. And there are databases for safe cleaning chemicals. And I've been recommending, and I'm blanking out on the name of the organization that publishes the list. There actually happens to be a really quite good list for safer cleaning chemicals. I'm hesitant, but I just can't remember it on the one hand because I'm just having somebody just chatted, Barbara. Clearlia is a good database. My question about these databases is, do they review chemicals of concern for breast cancer when they vet that list? And I just don't know the answer. Maybe somebody knows. Anybody in the panel or on the call? I'd have to double check. You know, I know there are carcinogens and reproductive toxicants and asthma causing chemicals. I know they screen them for that. What I don't know is they would cross check it against, for instance, Meg, your most recent publication.
Yeah,
And I don't know.
about Cleria, their criteria, but the Safer Choice, the US EPA's sort of green chemistry program, a lot of all of their Safer Choice selected products, they have a large categories of cleaning materials and cleaning products. And if it's Safer Choice certified, then it doesn't have any Prop 65 chemicals in it and a bunch of other authoritative lists. We'll see if they want to integrate the BCRC list that we just published.
Right. I mean, that would be interesting, and it'd be interesting to see how many get knocked out and what cleaning chemicals remain. I assume there must be some out there on the market, but they really should use your list.
I think when people make decisions about what cleaning products they're going to use, I think they have a couple of considerations that I don't know how these lists factor them in. How effective are they? And especially if you're using a cleaning company or a housekeeper, in terms of, will that person be able to clean and keep it moving, or how much extra effort do they have to make and put into making something clean? Right? And then the other factor is the cost. We have found that a lot of the safer products are more costly than the regular products. So we live in a capitalist country, that's a reality, and people are continuously looking at effectiveness and price point. So, and if you are not the person in power making that decision, i.e., you don't get to decide what chemicals you use, or you are the person in charge. Those are very different power dynamics that go into how people choose what they will use to clean, whether it's industrial cleaning or your home that's being cleaned, whether you're making a personal decision for your housekeeper or your housekeeper's company is making a personal decision for her, or a cleaning decision for products they use. I have found that people who work as housekeepers have limited power in making those decisions also.
Those are great points. Thank you for sharing. Peggy, did you have something you wanted to say?
I was just going to add, this is something of an aside, but as part of sort of the follow-up work that we've been doing from our study, taking a look at house cleaners and janitors. One of the challenges has been dealing with groups that claim to be green cleaning, and some uncertainties, I think, which exist around how green are green cleaning products. I think that's something where there have maybe been some attempts at using safer products, but I think it's it's kind of like organic fruits and vegetables. How organic are they? So I think this is something that's worth thinking about a little further, especially because there's some groups that really are apparently trying to go green, as it were.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question for the taking stock study woman. How did you handle homemade personal care products in your study?
We did ask if people made their products, and we did gather that information and tried to get, what they use to make their products. I think in our next project, I think we're going to be a little more deliberate about how they do that and ask some of those questions. We didn't really have, I do have a slide somewhere, and I'm happy to send it to you later on how many people did make their products. It was actually not a very big number in our study who admitted to it or would, filled in that bubble. Some did, and they tended to make more things in the category of like lotions or oils were more common. And then the focus groups, people talked about that too, like body scented things.
Yeah, I think one of the points that Bob raised was the sheer number of products that these people used. I think we had a number like 1,200. And my comment to that was that people tried a lot of different things until they figured out what works for them in their price point, right? And I do think a lot of people mixed products and a lot of people made their own products, but didn't necessarily consider themselves making their own products, right? Because I use brand X and brand Y and mix them together. That's not me making my own product. But I think a lot of that happened also in terms of people mixing products. But there were a significant number of different things that folks used. And I think the other part that we didn't talk about much was that products were moving targets. I think that's the term that Bhavna used, in the sense that that manufacturers change the formulas for the product. So it might be the same product or the same product name, but it was a very different product if they change the manufacturer. So that seems to be a case. For instance, there was a product called Honey Pot, or a brand called Honey Pot, and they changed their whole formula when they were sold to another company, to a big company. Same thing happened with Carol's Daughter. It was quite, public in terms of their change of formula. And that makes a difference, because most of the products, if they change formulas, and they frequently do, don't make it a public issue. I don't believe that people need to take their magnifying glass and glasses to Target or CVS to buy whatever products that they're going to buy. But right now, we are still in that space, and you can't buy a product and think it will consistently be the same product because the formulas change.
I think this is such an important point because of its links to the need for public policy. We really tried to find any way of making comparisons over time, of finding patterns over time. We really hoped that the California Air Resources Board database would allow us to do that, to look, because they've been doing these product surveys since the late 90s. But there are things about how they do the survey and the consistency of the data availability, and also the infrequency with which they change their emissions estimates and emissions models, that prevented us from doing time comparisons, like looking at how products changed over time. And instead we wound up, trying to find that information essentially from biomonitoring, by looking at national trends in exposure and trying to divine what's behind that. And to me, that just screams for the need for public policy intervention about ingredient disclosure and reporting. If you're replacing a hazardous chemical, what are you replacing it with? And not to mention building information sources that we can use. This is information that we all ought to be able to access.
Absolutely. And we do have a question kind of along those lines of accessing information. For the products that were tested, where can folks find a list of those products that were found to contain possible cancer-causing agents, chemicals?
Well, we have them, but with this for Meg and Peggy, maybe you all, we tested some, but did you all test product? No. So we have that data, and we are still, so we did targeted and non-targeted testing. And so what came back was a pretty complicated mix, and we have yet to publicly share that data, but hopefully very soon, and we'll send it to you when we do. But we don't have a list, and it was a really small list. We actually struggled immensely trying to figure out what to test. And we ended up testing largely hair products. Because we were going to be doing a new study on hair straightening chemicals. So we wanted to sort of see what was in the hair products. And so a lot of that testing is hair product and leave-in hair products. So we kind of narrowed it down to sort of the leave-in hair category. So, and for those of you who are really interested, we can kind of follow up and share that.
I should say, I would point you all to Silent Spring also, because one of the studies that they published is that many of the products that were tested had a number of chemicals that weren't on the label. So even if you are doing your due diligence in terms of reading all your labels, then what we found is that many of the chemicals were simply not listed on the bottle. Which kind of leads back to Meg and her statement about the public policy about disclosures.
Yeah. Thank you. A quick question for Bob and Peggy. The visualization tool that you presented, is that available only in English, or are there other language options or plans to provide other languages?
Yep, unfortunately, it's only in English.
And then we have time for one final question, which is, does part of the study provide a solution? For example, provide education about how to replace the cleaning or beauty supplies for safer options? And I think Bhavna and Janette, you addressed that a little bit, but if anyone else has any other comment on that question, I'll end with that.
I just wanted to make one comment about the California State Cosmetics Program product database that Bob dropped in the chat, which is, I understand it's gotten a big infusion of resources, excuse me, and is probably getting stronger and stronger, but I'm so sorry. We tried to use it to track products over time, and the historical data is very inconsistent.
Yep. I think
And
Paula
we found
John-
out, we found out from Paula.
Paula Johnson, I think, knows that. Amy,
Oh, exactly. No, she told us about it.
Yeah.
That and in specific, we tried to look over time at certain ingredients like phthalates and how it was changing in product composition. And we would find a spike in and wondered what is this? Why is there suddenly more phthalates in this product category? And she said, well, we did outreach that year to retailers and manufacturers and told them about the need to report. So while I think that the data is getting better and better and may be useful for as we get later for ingredient searching, but doesn't tell us anything about how products have changed over time.
Right.
Understood. Sounds like a challenge. Well, with that, we're at time for this plenary session. I think we're going to take a 10-minute break and then come back for the breakout sessions. So thank you to all of our speakers this morning, and for all of you in the audience for your attention and your questions. And it looks like Katie might have some instruction.
I
For
do.
you.
I also want to thank the panel for all of this information. It's given us a lot to think about and some ideas for where we can go next. So I really appreciate your insights and work and comfort in this conversation. As Erika mentioned, we are now going to be moving to the breakout sessions. We're going to open up those rooms shortly. And you can choose which session you want to attend. You can jump between sessions. And I know that it's hard to choose between them. You can keep in mind that we are going to be recording them. So you will be able to catch up with what you missed, but also I wanted to bring that up because if you don't want to be shown in the recording in these rooms, you should turn off your camera. And as Erika mentioned, the breakout sessions will start at 12:50 to give you guys a little break. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in the rooms.